And now you are live.
We are back at House Education, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, February 11th, 2025. Moving into a committee discussion on H-129, which is the school construction bill. That was the result of the legislative task force that worked on it over the offseason. So the question is, the big question is, what do we want to do with this? How integral is it in people's minds to the bigger question of reform? Where are the areas that need to be adjusted in the bill, which I think we've talked about a lot. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. And we're going to thoughts. I'm going to start off with Representative Brady.
I feel like I want to go draw a whiteboard for this.
Feel free.
I know, can't do that. So instead you get to see my hand motions. I think it's integral, but I'm a little bit stuck on what the next steps are, because if I conceptualize sort of where we are and where we need to go, we have talked quite a bit about district sort of size, capacity. We have one proposal. We've heard from quite a few witnesses and modeling that somewhere in the sort of 3,700 to 3,900 is really your kind of ideal district size. The national average is 3,700, so quite a bit smaller than what's in those five. But I think we have some consensus that we need fewer districts than what we have. Five, maybe too few. I think is too few in the way that they are created, but there's work to do around some district consolidation and realignment, which we just got another reminder of how complicated it is, even if that seems simple. And then on the sort of class size level, this is why I would be on a whiteboard, at the most sort of local level is, you know, the class size piece, which again, we have quite a bit of testimony on from last session and this session. We have great research to draw on sort of educational impact of class size. And it leaves sort of in the middle school size, which to me feels the most challenging. The research might be clear about ideal school size. Class size is hard because we are talking about humans and teachers, and like there's going to be changes there, absolutely. District size is hard in a lot of ways, but school size is hard because it's also actually the physical footprint of you can change how many kids are in a room without changing the room, or less. You can change sort of district stuff without changing the physical layout of a district. District offices don't have the same constraints that an educational space like a school does. The school where we actually deliver the education is really linked to the physical infrastructure of that building too. So it's really hard. And if these two things are going to put some pressures on or help us to right size our system in some ways and probably consolidate and merge some schools, there's going to have to be some physical realignment of resources to just make that possible. There are schools that have excess space. There are some schools that are really tight. I've spent quite a bit of time in South Burlington lately, and we have some overcrowded schools. But you can't really do that middle level without some physical adding to buildings, building new buildings, changing buildings, infrastructure stuff. So I'm seeing this being a really integral piece of the whole pie. I don't have a better answer kind of what pieces of policy, but to say that we're going to sort of start putting some pressures on or some goals to improve our system and to gain some efficiencies is going to create pressure in that middle at the school size. And to say that then you have to somehow do that without the resources is, I think we're setting up sort of the impossible here. And they might not, we may need to build, or we may hope to build some new regional comprehensive high schools, but it also might be more simple things. Like if we're putting 2 or 3 elementaries together, one might need another wing or a slight reconfiguration, not a whole new building, but it's going to need some physical work to make that possible. So it feels very disingenuous if we are doing a whole bunch of transformation and we're talking about the actual footprint of our system, and we aren't addressing it. Feels like it's just a really disingenuous kind of policy step to the field. So I guess I say that more as like, we have to figure this out,
Yes.
but that also means the money. We have to figure out how much now.
Does anyone want to disagree with that?
I want to add to it
Okay.
because I think there's an assumption that, just a general assumption, that school communities don't really want to close their small schools in their communities. And I think that's legitimate assumption. But I also think that there's two things that play a great role in the pushback on closing your school. And that is the inability to merge with another school because of transportation and because of the cost to fix your buildings up. The other piece, because at this moment in time, through articles of agreement, school districts are not allowed to close schools. Communities have to do it. And when that happens, communities don't know what to do with the building. And when they don't have a path forward with the building itself, and this isn't really school construction aid, but if we don't recognize the challenge, they're not going to vote to support it. So I actually think that incentives to help a community overcome the loss, if we're going to go that route, I think school construction aid is number one, because right now people have their children in schools that are in very bad shape.
Yeah.
And they want them in a school that's in better shape. And I don't think there's a parent out there who doesn't agree with all the testimony you all took about the size of schools and what's the optimal environment for their children to get it. They want a good education for their kids. So I think school construction aid has got to play a role here. How much we can afford to put into it or whatever. We shouldn't forget that other municipal side of this, because it is a stumbling block.
Does anyone disagree with that? So what I'm hearing is a general consensus that, yeah, it's hard to move forward with change without this being a part.
It's not that I disagree with any of it. I think that like the placement of where it comes into play is more what I'm thinking. Like, yes, it's important, but do we need to make strides towards the direction we're going with districts, class sizes, make those strides before we can start needling in on the construction piece? Because what we do there is go, like, if we go to 5 districts and we go to certain class sizes, right? At some point, what's the inventory of schools we need, right? And that's going to dictate maybe where we're willing to do construction, where we're not willing to do construction because of that change. So that, I don't think that can't come until we, in my opinion, until we actually have a somewhat of a close decision or on our way to a decision. The districts, the school district, I think.
Well, I just, from a logistical point of view, I would just point out that one thing that this calls for is that if you want to qualify,
Right.
there's a
There you go.
process.
Right.
And it's actually probably a 2-year process
Yeah.
to like get on the list.
Yep.
So I think that you could move ahead with district changes before this would need to. We could probably do this and do that at the same time, and they would come together.
I'm not saying we wouldn't, I'm just saying like one way. The other might dictate this, some aspects of the construction.
That's absolutely. I think that's why we need an advisory board. And I would also just remind everybody that the study that was done shows that we have an immediate $6 billion need for school construction.
And it's one of our cost drivers. So every year, I mean, the challenge every year that it isn't addressed, there's no way we're going to begin to address the scale of it. But it is adding to the underlying budget pressures
Yes.
year after year after year, because whether they like the building or not, the kids have to go to school.
That's right.
And so we've got to keep the lights on, you know, the water that's dripping from the ceilings collected, whatever it is, but we're continuing to maintain them. That's
Kind of.
much of what we're doing with PCBs around them, but to maintain them just to keep these kids up to a school.
Yeah, I appreciate what Rep. Doberich said too. There's no doubt we need this. We need school construction put in place. We need to figure it out. I don't think, us doing the other pieces is in any way dictated by us having this put in place or not. I think we have to have it regardless on if we move forward with anything or not. Right, and I also think that what we figure out going forward with this whole proposal could organically make some things happen on the way with possible, consolidation of schools just organically. But regardless, we need this put in place now as soon as possible, I think. But I don't think one really dictates the other.
Wait a minute.
The concern would be how much money do you spend on construction on a building that may end up just being closed anyway? So having that priority list, going hand in hand, you need both. So that it's like, okay, where are the dollars gonna go? What are the priorities?
So I think that speaks to the importance of the advisory board, whose job it is to keep an eye on all of those factors at once.
If we
Yeah.
decide
Well,
the
that-
advisory board, I mean, as Ledge Council keeps reminding us too, the most powerful tool here would be statute, right? Would be so. And we don't have to necessarily see that. I realize the draft we've given you has that concept in there. It's the one I think that got murkier and murkier the closer we got to the end of our work.
Do we want to tackle, so maybe as we discuss this, let's tackle the mechanics of an advisory board and how it would work, probably first.
Could I ask
Oh.
a question about why an advisory board over the state board of education? Or when you say advisory board, could it be the state board of education?
I don't know, I know, I don't know if we heard specific testimony.
It was,
Um,
yeah, we had very limited, they came in, kind of gave some quick informal testimony. I think
Their testimony was they didn't have.
I'd say
in the
capacity.
current, in the sort of current role, but
But we could provide
We
them.
could.
we could provide that. We could, if it is. So I just talked about district level, school level, class level, then like above all of that is what's happening at the state level, right? State board, AOB and legislature. So I don't, maybe it's further resourcing or.
Maybe we start at the top.
Or targeting work from the state board.
I suspect it may also be a question of not capacity, number one.
Yeah.
But and number two, do you want a higher level of expertise in this one area on the advisory board?
Legislative council was there pretty much every meeting, maybe. John remembers any of that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
There you go. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I zoned out for a moment, so
No,
I'm on the
No
spot.
surprise.
Sorry, we were talking about this the Board of Education.
Oh, just-
Instead of the
just-
advisory board, why couldn't the Board of Education?
Sorry, I thought you had a more specific, okay, I did hear this question. I didn't zone out. I can't say why the group didn't elect for that to be the piece. I do recall exactly the testimony that I think you stated, which was that there might be capacity lacking. And I know that there had been some concern about particular public facing elements, which maybe you
Yep.
could achieve through the state board. I think another piece of this was that the proposed composition of the advisory board includes a member from the Vermont Bond Bank, which might be
Right.
something that
Okay.
you want to have
Yeah.
input on, but that's not to say that you couldn't leverage the state board in some way and then have input from. So I would just say, in my duration on this working group, I never heard a real appetite for the state board to be serving this advisory function, but there's nothing that says you can't do that.
Could be said that like the advisory board, especially if it has some people with expertise in the area on it, could actually make decisions quicker and more efficiently than going to the Board of Education, which has many things on its plate. So maybe that's another reason why this would be beneficial. It's something that has such a need now, it can help expedite that process instead of decisions kind of lingering.
I'll just go over the composition as it's
Yeah.
listed. 4 members who shall serve as ex officio members, the treasurer, the commissioner of buildings and grounds, general services, executive director of the bond bank, and the chair of the state board of education. Then 4 members, none of whom shall be legislators. 2 members appointed by the speaker and 2 members appointed using the Senate method, committee on committees. But it does say, each of whom shall have expertise in education or construction, real estate, or finance. And 1 of whom shall represent a supervisory union, and 1 of whom shall be an educator. So I think sounds like there really was an effort to bring a level of expertise to this advisory board.
I just want to remind everybody that this board, this committee was brought to us, initially started off having much more teeth than an advisory board.
Yeah.
And like gatekeeping to rulemaking as well. So it was a lot more to it at that point. And as we went through the process, it got turned into an advisory committee in its current capacity.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why you went that route? And I know we sort of had the
You know,
conversation
we
previously.
can, I actually, I think maybe it was one of the ones that agreed with the gatekeeping model, so that's kind of, I appreciated having that kind of safety net in place.
I mean, gatekeeping in the sense that they would be
gatekeeping
the
that-
rule makers.
They wouldn't be the rule makers, AOE would still be the rule makers, but the board as it was first presented to us would basically have the yes or no on that rulemaking, would decide if that rulemaking was gonna be put in place or try again.
Basically like veto power.
Veto power,
over
right.
rulemaking. And I think some of the thinking there was the oddity of that structure to have a segmented process where the agency has the opportunity to go through formal rulemaking, but has to check in with someone else before they can proceed through that process. And in particular, there was a functional concern about, and of course you could change the advisory board's meetings, but whether the board as set up would have the capacity to handle, particularly if you think of this as something that's meant to help kickstart the program, right? It's time limited in duration. Would they be able in 6 meetings within a year, be able to serve as an effective gatekeeper, or would they actually be holding up the process and delaying implementation of the program? But of course, you could address that by changing the number of meetings too. So I think there are functional concerns that went into backing away from that gatekeeping piece as well.
Does this commission exist? This
No.
this
No.
committee? Oh, okay. This was in theory.
It's just a proposed
It's just a theory,
advisory
okay.
board in the-
It's pliable, right? I mean,
Okay.
that's what we're gonna decide on here.
So to your point before, this would be the group that we would go to, and after we all hashed it out and said, this is what needs to be designed, these are the goals, these are the numbers you need to we need these recommendations, like that's the input, we can feed that in and say, have at
It's
it.
got a number of charges, I think, in here, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's essentially to say, does it design the bonuses? Or does it implement the bonuses that we design?
In all instances, it is advisory. So the AOE is tasked with developing each of these pieces, but in statute, at least currently the proposal is that this board would have a key role, at least as envisioned. Now, maybe they don't comply with this, but that's the vision behind this, in helping with rulemaking for the program at large, developing project priorities and proposed legislation to kind of tweak the system over that 10-year period. So trying to course correct, make sure that it's right off on the right foot. But yes, they would have a say in your orientation of the program. And I would just call it again what I said last time, and I think where we ended before. You guys have the opportunity to take a stance on those project priorities and bonus incentives. That's something you can do, and I think that you are equipped to do if you don't want to leave that to the rulemaking process as advised by this envisioned advisory board.
But you look at the intent section here. I guess, do we have we don't have an
The
intent.
statement,
We have
policy, very
very
beginning of
policy.
the policy.
Statement of policy.
Oh, it's the intent, yeah.
I mean, I suppose that's where we got the clearest.
Is that under John Grace?
If
Yeah,
it's helpful, I can
yeah,
also
it's
screen
Just
share.
search for H129.
Yeah, I got it.
It says,
Maybe that's another way to think about this in the statement of policy. Prioritizing cost, geographic accessibility, 21st century facility standards, enrollment trends, capacity, and scale. Like, who are the right people or the right positions to focus on and execute those goals?
So the way it reads right now is there is the intent statement there. The AOE would take that intent statement, develop a program in concert with the advisory committee, which is advisory only. And then whatever they came up with, they would then move into rulemaking. There's no real check back with the legislature, for one thing, and the advisory group is really the only sort of watching over of the agency, or but yet has no real power. Not that I am thinking anybody's going to go crazy here, because I think everybody's very much on the same page as to what the goals are. Would you just speak a little bit, John, about the importance of the intent section of this? Because there is a check back through LCAR
Sure.
when it comes to rulemaking.
Yeah, so a couple of responses. One, your description is completely fair. The one qualification I might add is that there are required reporting pieces. So the agency would have to come back annually to the legislature to report on implementation of the program. So it's not entirely out of sight of you guys. But that's right, the policy statement, so section 1, the reason that the working group spent so much time on this is that there was a broad extension of rulemaking authority to the agency to develop this program. And so this was seen as the way to input the agency's interpretation of its rulemaking powers. And in particular, there are pieces that call out or cite to the specific section. So if you look at section 2, subdivision 2, the agency shall be responsible for adopting rules pertaining to school construction and capital outlay, including rules to specify a point prioritization methodology and a bonus incentive structure aligned with the legislative intent expressed in section 3440. So this was a way of not going all the way in legislative language, not going all the way to codify or put in statute particular prescriptive rules, but to say that the agency, as you develop these rules to implement the program, you need to pay attention to these particular standards. And this is, always done against the backdrop of, and why LCAR is so important, you can't impermissibly delegate authority to the executive. And so you have to provide adequate guidelines when you extend this kind of power to the executive. So this is that confining, cabining discretion piece that's happening in the proposed. This is what limits the agency's rulemaking power, but it would still need to go through the whole formal rulemaking process. There would be public comment, public hearing. It would still need to go before LCAR. So there would be multiple check-ins on this. So the set of review pieces, I think you could characterize the set of safeguards that are in place for this are: 1, the advisory board that you've identified; 2, the regular reporting that's required; 3, the constraints through the policy section on how rulemaking will be developed; and then the actual formal rulemaking process itself all kick in to cabin the agency's discretion for this proposal.
Good work here.
So, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't, I'll follow up with you maybe, but maybe it's the two of you. Because you were involved with this. Was it the intent to use a school construction aid program to support the mergers of school buildings, or the shift in school buildings, or was it the intent to encourage or to even to force and those things to happen? And then I'd love to hear what both of you say about that. And then I want to know whether there's any mechanism in this that could create one or both. Thanks.
I don't think it was any intent to force.
No.
At all. I do, think there was intent to
Incentivized.
gently guide and incentivize, some merging if somebody were needing to, qualify for school construction, they would have a different incentive level and cover one of the priorities.
I think certainly the intent was to encourage, and we didn't solve the challenge we're all in, which is that we wanted to both do that, encourage sort of where we're going to a future state. And the reality is the state that we're in right now, the need is dire. And so there's never going to be enough funding for either of those buckets of just what we need right now for, deferred maintenance and what we need for encouraging this future state. So, I guess that comes down to the the prioritization, the eligibility, the prioritization criteria, and the bonus incentives then, and how those get defined. Because it has the potential to really go down one path or the other, and both are dire needs.
So that's where I'd love to hear.
Yep, so I'll go out on a limb and respond to first the question that wasn't addressed to me, but in support of the legislative that working group. Entirely incentives, as you guys will recall, this program is for those availing themselves of state aid. It otherwise is not applicable, so you're not required to go through this route. You could take some different practice. So this is meant to be a carrot approach. There are a number of pieces that do speak to this consolidation concern. So if you look at the very end of section 1, that statement of policy, this will be the top of page 2. Joint construction projects between 2 or more school districts and consolidation of buildings within a district where feasible and educationally appropriate are encouraged. And then I would note further on, make sure I just have this right. If we jump down to probably section 5, let me see. No, section 6, I'm sorry. Yeah, section 6. So if you jump to page 11, this is the eligibility section of the Secretary of Education's approval of a preliminary application. So you'll recall that there is this first piece checking on fulfillment of a set of needs. So an application that goes through this process will need to show that it meets a particular set of needs. That's what you see at the very bottom of page 10. So the secretary may approve a preliminary application if the project or part of the project fulfills a need occasioned by, and then there's a set of 4 different needs. New language that the working group added, because that is existing law that you see those particular needs set out, is on page 8. This or the project results in consolidation of 2 or more school buildings and will serve the educational needs of students in a more cost-effective and educationally appropriate manner, as compared to individual projects constructed separately. So what this particular provision does is that as there are a set of eligibility conditions that a preliminary application has to meet all of these eligibility conditions under current law and here, the first eligibility condition is this meeting a set of needs fulfillments. But the new language that's added here allows a project that doesn't meet any of those particular needs. So it's not deterioration of an existing building. It's not inadequate to provide programs under law. But if it results in consolidation and will serve educational needs in a more cost-effective manner, it could meet that as an eligibility condition as an alternative to meeting those sets of needs. So this is added as an incentive to say, you may not meet the needs-based portion of our eligibility criteria, but if you are consolidating, you're going to satisfy that condition. You still have other eligibility conditions that you have to meet. So I don't want to say that you're just through the door at that point. But this was new language added to try to add encouragement to the process.
But it's still just encouragement.
Right.
And we all, in the past, we had a similar deck, although we had more financial encouragement because it was 50%, as opposed to 30 if 2 or more had merged. What I guess I'm trying to get at is there anything in moving rulemaking to the agency that could, in the way we've written it here, that could
Absolutely. So the rulemaking would be developing the priority points and bonus incentives. So there's a base 20% figure provided covering eligible costs across the lifetime of the debt service for a project. So debt service lifetime costs. But there would be additional bonus incentives contemplated by the program that would add additional funds additional state aid to a particular project, and that could be up to an additional 20%. No increments are specified, so maybe you're just getting 5% for something. But those bonus incentives, the additional dollars that are going, are under the current proposal going to be built out in rule by the agency as advised by the advisory board. The agency could permissibly look at the intent language in the first section and see this particular language about consolidation and the other conditions above, and include as one of its bonus incentives projects that result in consolidation. So there might be extra dollars available. It doesn't contemplate that there would be a requirement. That's not something that's built out here. But the agency could further incentivize consolidation through rulemaking.
So I think one of the big questions to ask ourselves is there a better way than to have the agency sort of develop a plan in connection with the advisory committee and then do rulemaking? I would say that the alternative to that is us doing it. But these would be things like saying, all right, well, yes, if you bring two schools together under one roof, you get an extra 20%. It would be literally
What it was
coming up with
before.
all of that. I think what is proposed here is very realistic and frankly doable if you give the agency the capacity to do it. But it's something that we would decide.
But I think I asked the question because I think it has a great impact on if we move forward on whether there's an advisory board. I think the advisory board is a check and balance
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah,
which is,
does anybody want to say that we shouldn't have an advisory board?
No, I agree with having.
I know you
agree
supported
with
that,
having.
You wanted to have more power.
I think so, right. And the question that I had when we made it an advisory board is, was it gonna go on a perpetuity or was it gonna sunset?
Got
We
it.
decided to have a sunset at a certain point.
Yeah.
At least to stand up this program and help get it.
To Rep Long's point, which I think is helpful for contextualizing kind of high level thinking about how you might draft this program. The greater specificity that you guys took in the statute, for instance, if you spelled out all of the priority points, all of the bonuses, and all that you left were kind of technical administrative pieces for rulemaking by the agency, the need for an advisory board might be significantly less in context. So it's just to say that you could consider these in context, and if you go down the lane of building out a lot of statute and kind of limiting the agency's rulemaking power within this program to relatively technical pieces, then you might be looking at a different picture.
So I would just throw this out, and I don't mean it to sound to steer your thoughts in any way, but if not this sort of
Then-
method, then what? How do the two of you sort of feel about what's in front of us after
Yeah,
having been through because I think that the idea was sort of like, well, this is more of a placeholder or whatever. But it's actually seems to be a fair bit there. Wait, do you want?
I mean, there's just some further context and background, we had testimony briefly from the state board that liked the concept of some other voice body being in it. It isn't them with more capacity. We had testimony at some point from the AOE who worked really closely on the working group with us that liked having an independent body involved in overseeing some of the prioritization and how those are implemented. And if I think back to last session and this committee, I think there was a pretty strong feeling about having the kind of finance bond bank treasurer perspective really at the table here. Whether that, we probably need further testimony from them. We got it last year, but whether this really gets us there, but that there's a eye towards kind of the state finances that's so important and part of this. The head of the bond bank has been a really helpful thought partner in a lot of this. He uses this again and again, so I've written it down. Vermont school facilities are a liability that require a policy solution. Our current system is not keeping pace with depreciation and is increasing financial risk to school districts and states. Like it's been a pretty powerful reminder, and I think he has some innovative thinking around how we could do some of this. So bringing that perspective, knowing whatever we create is probably going to be a pretty small office at the Agency of Education, and they're going to do most of the technical work. But having some of the other, like, those who are listed in this group, somehow eyes on the program, helping us steer this course, has felt like an important part of what we didn't have previously and what we particularly need in this moment in time. But and the other concept that was thrown out was like, do we want something as robust as the Green Mountain Care Board? Like, are we talking about that kind of a model of its interface with education? I don't know. That obviously we all know some about the Green Mountain Care Board right now, but you know, a very professional,
Fully salaried.
right?
And as far as, you know, I had some different thoughts as we're going through the process, but I'm completely happy with where we kind of landed here. This really consumed a lot of our time, and this group was trying to come up with this advisory committee. I don't, you know, and I actually like leaving it up to the Agency of Education to come up with those bonus incentives. I don't personally, I'll speak for myself. I don't think I have the ability to decide what those are going to be. I think they're more in a place where they should be deciding based on a vision, right, of where we want our education system to be in the future.
And that envisions the AOE having additional staff people with expertise in this area.
Which is important as I think we're getting the formal budget request presentation from the AOE this week. So there's an important, you know, through line that we need to follow. But the rough estimate was 3, you know, 3 FTEs. You need an office of at least 3 to sort of stand up and administer program.
That being said, still open for suggestions.
Yeah.
What part of this proposal do you feel needs more attention from this committee?
Maybe I flip the question to the committee. Is it the role of where do people feel comfortable in terms of the makeup of the committee or council, and the role of the committee or council? Is there one or the other?
You're talking about the committee.
It's the advisory group. Like, are we? I suppose I would start with the role. Are we sort of at consensus that it's advisory? And then once you make that decision, sort of, then how do we feel about the people who have been put on it? What its purpose is probably matters before you decide who the people are.
I'm gonna flip that around.
Okay.
I think for me, like after I read it before, but hearing it again, the makeup of the committee, it is nice to hear that there's many layers of expertise in areas. I think that's important, that broad stroke. So for me, like the makeup of the committee, without putting any more thought into it, I like it. I think I could dig in a little deeper and maybe try and pull in some other thoughts from, you know, different, like from construction and stuff like that from people in the field. But I like that. As far as their powerful role, as I said earlier, to me, there's something about having that committee be able to make those decisions and present them in a quicker manner than maybe a certain an organization that does many things can do, right? So I think having it as that advisory piece is, or even or a decision making piece, I'm not sure, but I like that it could be a committee that, or a group of people that can make a decision quickly when there's a need, quickly.
As we're having this conversation, and please continue, also think about like what, and with that, I'd like to hear from so-and-so. It occurs to me, I think it'd be a good idea if we brought in Bob Johnson from AOE to sort of talk about, he's their sole employee dealing with this stuff. And he can sort of talk about what he does, his expertise, the kind of expertise they might be looking for if we were to staff it.
If I knew someone who, or had access to someone who could talk about from the contractor construction side who does schools, not just the top, but regionally, who would I help them get in touch with? Who have some an email to you guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I may have
And
some-
just so you know, so this committee, House Education Committee has been dealing with this now.
Right.
This is year 3. I'd say year 1 and 2,
heard a lot of that.
we heard a lot from Arch and Truex Collins and a lot of people.
Go back. Those.
In fact, Truex Collins was represented on the initial task.
That's
Year
right.
ago, technically.
Well, yes, if you look at make an initial task force, you'll see broad representation.
Go back to this.
May I offer
Yep.
some things?
Yes, please.
So the basis for a lot of the language that you see in H129 is kind of the meat of the program under existing law is Title 16, Section 3448. And there are a few pieces of that that we did not really get to or spend time on. You don't necessarily have to address these pieces, but these are things that in the past, the legislature thought appropriate to address in statute. So we didn't spend a lot of time on emergency aid. I know that that was a particular piece that is you're going to want to think about. Small pieces, and this may be easily disposed of through rulemaking, but eligible construction costs. Do you want to spell out particular space parameters, or is that just something that the agency should be dealing with?
Can I stop
Yep.
right here? Traditionally, that has been the purview of the agency to decide what was eligible.
Yes, exactly. And so there's a provision in existing law to say that that's spelt out in rulemaking. That's not currently part of this proposal. That could very easily be added. This is just pieces we did not get to in the working group. Under existing law, there's a requirement for refund upon sale. So a school district that's selling off a school construction facility has to pay back the percentage of aid they received up to the max of the value.
You say these things already exist.
This is what's on the books in Title
Current.
16, Chapter
So if we
123,
did nothing, they would continue to be on the books.
under the moratorium, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The vision behind this proposal was that this would replace existing 123. It doesn't currently do that. There's no repeal language broadly. But what was, I think the thinking behind this was that you would be replacing the existing program. So removing things like the deferred maintenance requirement that would prevent almost any aid from happening under our newly instituted program. Yeah, so I think spacing cost parameters, whether you want repayment as a condition of aid, how to deal with emergency aid would be particularly important pieces to address, or at least things that past legislatures have thought about in the context of this kind of program. And then maybe how to deal with CTE facilities is not something that we spent time on.
There was discussion on the work as well about independent schools and if they would have access to this in any fashion. We didn't really dive into that. The CTEs for sure, I don't like. But
Yeah, I don't want to misstate the education proposal. I was reading through the packet earlier today. So, you know, I guess I should confirm this before saying it, but what I recall is that there's kind of a separate envisioned stream for CTE. And we had talked last week, I think, about how this kind of maintenance that we're talking about is not built into
Right.
the funding proposal that's part of the program. The CTE stream may be different. So this would be worth looking at to see if the CTE funding stream does include extra funds for CTE facilities. Maybe you recall, okay.
think so.
Why would we be treating CTEs any differently than any other public school?
I think we should. Yeah, they need help.
Yeah.
Different cost drivers.
Well, they definitely have different
Yeah.
uses of their
Yeah.
facility.
Yeah.
No.
So do they get a, well, anyway, just good question.
They should be in the mix. They're important. We need more.
Is there something in here about requiring districts to set aside 3% of their budget for maintenance? I just can't.
I don't think so.
Thought that's
Tied into the-
because that's in
DQS.
DQS, like
Okay.
I think
this all sort of assumes.
Right.
Well, and now DQS is on its way to becoming,
Starting.
being implemented in July, so this assumes. We're also in a future ecosystem with a bit better handle on our operations and maintenance, budgets and maintenance and, you know, the kind of year to year oversight of our system. Obviously, that's not gonna happen if you flip the switch on July 1, but
So I have a question for the two of you. The bill puts in a base amount of 20%.
Yep.
Why did you do that as opposed to just sort of making that all part of the AOE coming up with a point and award system?
I'm not sure why we decided to take that on ourselves, but there was a lot of discussion about what level, if there was a base, would entice people to want to, would entice people, be enough to entice people, but also leave enough room for the bonus incentives and everything. That's really what we wanted to focus on, was the bonus incentives, and that would be the kind of the driving factor of, you know, how might we want to kind of guide school construction into the future.
it's not a super scientific.
No.
The whole
Yeah,
program was what,
completely
30%?
30.
And so it was
It's
like,
30 and
oh,
50.
it's sort of like that, but a little less, but still sounds like
But
a lot.
wouldn't this theoretically allow a district to put in for a 20% base funding on a school that everybody can see probably shouldn't be there anymore? Because it's certainly saying, well, anybody who wants to do anything
I think
that qualifies, is gonna get 20%.
I think that's kind of
It's
the
a
whole
lot of
process.
criteria.
The application process.
You wouldn't fit it.
You wouldn't necessarily.
You wouldn't hit eligibility.
Right.
Yeah, there are strict eligibility criteria you have to meet, including meeting those 4 sets of, including that first needs-based piece or consolidation, but there's eligibility criteria that you have to get through. There's considerations separate from eligibility, so they don't have to be met, but things that the secretary thinks about when reviewing particular applications. And then additionally, on top of that, there would be whatever pieces are built out through rulemaking. So if you feel content with the eligibility conditions, you don't have to have this particular concern, but if you are concerned about this, I would just encourage you to look at the eligibility conditions, which are, if you look at the bottom of page 10, line 18, that's where you want to look. So this is it's not super, section 6, so it's section 3445 sub A sub 2B. I'm just going through some of it. It's not even-
I assume that includes like, you know, have a facilities master plan,
Exactly.
which would, I assume, make people think about what they're putting their money into.
Yep. So facilities master plan, achieving the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards, fitness through those in lines 12 through 16. So need can't reasonably be met by another means, and the proposed type, kind, quality, size, and estimated cost are suitable. The proposed curriculum and meet all legal standards. So you have to go through you have to fit through the funnel to get here. And if you are dissatisfied with the funnel, that is something that you guys would be equipped to tweak.
And we could, you know, depending on what our process is next, be things worth asking, you know, AOE too, because they worked on this with us a lot.
They
and
proposed the
really-
last of these eligibility conditions, those related to the proficiency of district quality standards and the facilities master planning process. Those were both offered by brought by Jill. And I did just want to go back to the point about the CT facilities. I misspoke. You're absolutely right. There's no facilities piece of the budget in the education transformation proposal.
You had mentioned that one thing that wasn't in here was emergency aid, although there is $100,000 emergency aid.
Yes, so that just duplicates, I don't think it's something that the working group spent much time on getting to, other than to point out that it required further
The current-
consideration.
Is current law 100,000?
Current law
It's some crazy low number.
is
Very low.
100,000.
Oh, it
It's
is.
a
It's 100,000.
Oh, but we only fund it at $50,000.
I said 50,000's in my head.
And this was something where I don't recall the full context, but Jill kept mentioning this dual track model for particular kinds of projects. You'd have project that could meet the traditional standards for funding through the program as envisioned, but you'd have another kind of different track for, I'm envisioning things like that don't necessarily meet existing rule standards for emergencies. I don't know if you guys happen to remember this, but there was envisioned a category of projects that the agency deemed to be
Yep.
appropriate for funding that are neither captured by the full application process or the emergency piece. And that's not included in this draft. And I don't know that the reason it's not included is not reflective of the working group rejecting that idea. It was just more, didn't address that piece.
But I think they had talked about coming back to us, bringing back some more specific either language or plan or thoughts around that, this track of the work. And the Rhode Island program has like several spurs. This doesn't completely on that, but I vaguely remember there being a sort of corollary in Rhode Island because they had those different funding
They did,
streams.
yes. I would say, just my initial reaction is maybe that would muddy the water at this point.
Yeah, I
And-
think it
but
was.
But if we could certainly add next year or whenever. If it seems like that's it. This is a very good base piece for us to work on, which frankly, we're finding little fault with. So just read it over, think about it. What else we need to talk about?
I think probably then it's getting some of the feedback and testimony from stakeholder groups that were outlined in our creation of this, to get feedback on it, and then, you know, the money piece.
This is the big one.
Great.
If
All right,
there,
we'll close, further questions, discussion?
I was just gonna mention what I mentioned before. If there were, if we were going to have this to a successful program, I don't know how it fits into this, but I'm gonna bring it up anyway. If there were guidelines or some help for municipalities on what to do with buildings we
Yeah.
close, I just think we want
That's
to keep
missing.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it belongs here or who would have sort of like, you know, got up. I don't know, but I'm just worried about that piece.
No, if you want to hear somebody talk about that, the head of the Bob is.
Oh, that's great.
he is
That's,
really-
that's good to hear.
And as we were sort of talking with leadership about different committees in the House dealing with different things, I said that was a discussion that maybe the Commerce Committee could enter into, but I agree with you. I think that needs to be thought about in this bill. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
because I know there's like there's questions that aren't getting answered.
So maybe this isn't responsive, but I would call out that under section 2, the list of responsibilities for the Agency of Education, there are particular provisions related to kind of outreach to school districts of technical assistance for both the application process and the school construction process in 2 schools. So if the thought was that this was going to be a hands-off program in which school districts are left to fight on their own, competing for funds, I don't think that's what's envisioned here. There's meant to be some hand-holding through the process, but you could develop that.
I think what we're talking about,
Oh,
and maybe this is something we could put in here, is that part of any application can include up to $50,000 for the community to re-envision a building that is closing.
Yeah,
And that's what you're
I-
talking about.
I
It's really
am. I'm
providing
not-
some
I wasn't-
significant help to a community.
right. I mean, honestly, 50,000 would be wonderful, but even just guidelines around a process, you know, because I'm telling you, I'm experiencing it in one of my communities that they basically voted no to close because they have no idea what happened. Couldn't get any answers, don't know. what
They
to
didn't know
do.
what they would do with a closed empty building.
Yeah, should we do it for $1 or not?
Right.
You know, and
I've
were-
been to towns where they have said, we will never buy back. because of
is in terrible
out.
shape. But to some communities, it makes sense to tear it right down and
Yeah.
use the, so we
Which
just
would
need
come at
help.
significant cost.
So just mentioning it, we want to help ease the process.
Okay, let's